Our last talk today is by the proud author of Mingqiu Yunnan de Wyoming Jingqi Muslini Huyi. And he will...
there will be a test on this at the end of the hour.
He will assuredly correct my pronunciation. Michael Brose is a faculty member in the Department of History, although as Tom had pointed out to both Michael and I yesterday, he's now been made into a department head, which is the first step towards the dark side. But Michael has been working on issues in China. He began in what I would think of as the medieval period, the 13th century, and he studied the Uyghurs. And Michael and I have an interesting back and forth that we go over almost every time we get into a discussion, because the Uyghurs were Muslims within China, and I say, oh, so you're studying religion. And Michael says, no, I'm studying the Uyghurs. So we go back and forth about his terminology and how he uses it as a professor of history, and about how I use it as a professor of religious studies, often using the same words. And I say, oh, you're talking about religion. He says, oh, no, I'm not. I'm talking about politics, or I'm talking about ethnic groups, or whatever. So today, so he told me he was not talking about religion today, even though he has a religious group in the title.
Communist.
So I will let him unpack that for you. Michael has been an active scholar. He gives talks and lectures both locally and around the world to different groups. He has worked on things as different as using Confucius, Uyghur elites in Mongol China. He's talked about Genghis Khan. And recently he's given lectures and talked about new Chinese mosques and in the Eurasian Islamic world. And so with that sort of variety of things, I'm going to introduce you to Michael Brose, who will talk to us about the People's Republic of China, communist, capitalist, or Confucian. Michael.
Thanks. Thanks for this invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. I feel it's a great honor to be able to talk with you and discuss some of these issues. I feel a pretty heavy burden, though. I'm having to fill the shoes of two great presentations that have come before me, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it, but hopefully I'll do my best. Carol said something towards the end of her talk, which I found really interesting, and I want to key off of it. She said, the present is the key to the past. And as a historian, I think that that's absolutely true. The present is the key to the past, but I want to flip that around and say the past is the key to the present and the future. And when I teach history to my students, I am always telling my students, the last thing I want you to do is to approach the study of history as an accumulation of abstract facts, because that's nonsense. The reason I study history is so that I can figure out why people are making the decisions they make and where they're headed to. For me, my study is focused on China, and I can guarantee you that if there's any society in the world that takes history seriously, it's the Chinese people and the state of the People's Republic of China. So hopefully today what I'll be able to do is unpack a bit of how history has been translated. As Paul also mentioned, I do religious studies, and so another title of this talk could actually be the religious expressions of nationalism. Because if you really press me, communism, capitalism, and Confucianism, they're all isms. And in a sense, an ism may be considered a type of a religious belief, if you will. And we can pursue that later if we want. So let me get into my specific talk, though. Because one of the things that my students are always interested in when I teach my courses on Chinese history or international studies, they're always interested in why has China risen so quickly and where is it going? And my answer to that, I actually have two answers. One is I say, from the Chinese perspective, that's the wrong question. The right question from the Chinese perspective is, why has China fallen down so quickly as a world power? Okay? And then, where are we going? We, the Chinese people. Okay? And I tell my students that the answer to those questions lies in understanding China's 19th and 20th century histories of violation by outsiders, in other words, colonialism, and also more recent changes in China's society, and especially in the Chinese Communist Party that I hope to unpack today. China views itself as historically a world power that was only recently undermined by Western and Japanese colonial imperialists who wanted to exploit China to satisfy their own greed. Since overthrowing the last imperial system in 1911, all of the leaders of China have really been focused on one goal, and that is to regain China's historic status and power as a world nation, or a world state, or a strong power. They've done this most critically and importantly by creating the nation out of the old empire and using these three ideologies or isms that I've just described as agents of nationalism. I would argue, and in fact the whole sum and total of my talk is to argue that all of these isms, communism, capitalism, and Confucianism, are contradictory, or are complementary, not contradictory. And they continue, all three of them, to be deployed by China's leaders as they work towards the goal of rebuilding China into a world power. Various manifestations and expressions of Chinese nationalism are the natural result of about 200 years of history, a pretty short window in the longue durée history of China. If we in the West want to have a constructive relationship with China in the coming decades, a relationship that's based as much on engagement as it is on competition, we need to understand this history from China's perspective and how China intends to achieve its goals. Okay? I have up here a photograph of the father of China, and Mr. Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Zhongshan in Chinese pronunciation. This picture is when he was living in Hawaii and planning the revolution of 1911. Here's just a simple map of colonialism at work in China. And I won't take the time to really discuss these holdings, these colonial holdings. But you can see that China was framed on pretty much all sides by absolute colonial holdings. And during the time period I'm talking about, this is going to have a huge impact on China. To understand the roots of nationalism in China, we have to go back to the 1830s to start, when China was first confronted with the specter of invincible Western military power. The so-called Opium Wars of 1839 to 42, begun by the British to keep their opium flowing from northern India into China in spite of objections from the Chinese court. That marked the first time that China was militarily unable to control its own destiny. The British bombardment opened up China for the first time ever to an uninterrupted chain of incursions onto Chinese soil by all the Western great powers and eventually by Japan. And by the 1890s, there was serious talk of slicing up the Chinese melon among these states. What I've provided you here is a micro view of that melon. This is a view of the port city of Tianjin in about 1930, showing all of the different concession holdings by the various colonial powers, the Japanese, the French, the Brits, the Germans, the Russians, the Italians, Hungarians, etc., etc. That's just a microcosm of what China would have looked like had these imperialist powers had their way. Revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen realized that the Chinese throne was incapable of holding off these ventures, and that the answer to China's weakness, in fact, lay in getting rid of the imperial system entirely, as well as the old Confucian culture that was the basis of that system, and replacing that whole system and culture with a new nation that was based on scientific principles, which would better represent the interests of the Chinese people, as opposed to the foreign Manchus who ruled the last Qing dynasty and also the Western and Japanese invaders. The two best models at the time, the 1890s, for the evolving Chinese nation were, in fact, Japan, which had leaped from being a medieval state to defeating Tsarist Russia and being considered a great power within the span of about 40 years, and the United States. Since the revolutionary Sun had spent time in both places, the Republic of China that he formed in 1912 borrowed elements from both. Sun's Republic of China that he formed in 1912 was a radical new enterprise that he based on three core concepts that he called the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and this thing called the people's livelihood. First concept, nationalism, or anti-imperialism. Oops, pressed the wrong button here. Essentially returned power to the people of China from foreign parties. The second concept, democracy, meant for Sun that China would be governed by a popularly elected representative government, not an emperor. A total flipping of the hierarchy of power. And his third concept, guaranteeing the people's livelihood, was a mixture of capitalist and socialist ideals, where the state's main role was to control the means of production, especially land, and to guarantee an egalitarian economic order, as well as restore a sound revenue stream to the government for the first time in probably 40 or 50 years. Unfortunately, as we know, Sun died in 1925 before he could really implement his system in China. And on his death, the fragile coalition of radicals and revolutionaries that he held together fell apart. In fact, if you look at this coalition, it was a real mixture of strange bedfellows, anywhere from far-right fascists to far-left anarchists and communists, all of whom were held together by Sun's magnetic personality, really, and that was pretty much it. By the mid-1920s, of course, the other even more immediate example for Chinese nationalists of the new strong nation built on the ashes of its imperial predecessor was, of course, Soviet Russia. The Russians had not only just overthrown the old imperial system and had begun to build a vibrant new state based on communist principles that seemed to guarantee Sun's third category of guaranteeing the people's livelihood. Just as important, Soviet Russia was unilaterally canceled all of the harsh, unequal treaties that the former Tsar had imposed on Imperial China. The only other state to do that at that point was Germany. Sun had sent some of his most trusted lieutenants to Moscow to learn how to apply the Soviet model to China. One of them, Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Jieshi in the Chinese pronunciation of his name, returned to organize Sun's military forces in southern China. After Sun's death, Jiang propelled himself to the leadership of the Republic of China. We see him in the middle here. And soon thereafter abandoned his interests in communism for a much more traditional social and political order that relied on a narrow group of self-interested landowners and urban industrialists. In fact, the group that was Jiang's basis of power were the same old elites who had caused problems in late imperial China. Other members of Sun's coalition continued to believe that communism was the answer to China's problems, especially because of the focus by the Russian revolutionaries on Russia's silent majority, the peasants and workers. Anyone who had experienced China's vast countryside also understood that that same group, the silent majority in China, represented a huge untapped pool of anger and manpower. If harnessed and managed, those people would provide the needed energy to radically reshape China, the necessary first step in any rebuilding campaign. To turn once again to the old elite, as Chiang Kai-shek presumed to do, provided no real answer for China's ills. The ineffectiveness of Jiang's version of the new nation could be seen in his inability to establish control over the several competing regional warlords that dominated China and which relegated the effective power of his Republic of China to this narrow band of the industrial heartland along the eastern coast of China. The framers of the Chinese Communist Party, however, also knew that China was quite different from Russia, not least because China's silent majority were really poor rural farmers, not urban factory workers. While Jiang's party organizers were based in the cities, the Chinese Communist Party filled the gap in China's vast countryside, organizing, educating, and leading the peasants, who constituted at that point well over 90% of China's total population. Out of that struggle came new ways of doing everything from war, the so-called guerrilla warfare that we all know so well now, to farming, organizing cooperatives, and organizing cities. Communism really was perceived as a better way to achieve all of Sun's core concepts of the new nation than Jiang's Republic of China. By the early 1930s, a young librarian and junior member of the early party named Mao Zedong had risen through the party ranks. He really understood the needs and the latent power of the rural peasantry because he himself came from that class. He led the Chinese Communist Party to organize the peasants to fight and defeat both the Japanese colonial invaders and eventually Chiang Kai-shek's faction in the Civil War. It's important here to remind ourselves that Mao was really no different from either Sun or his arch-rival Jiang, in that all three of these men were first and foremost nationalists whose chief goal was to rebuild China into a world power. Sometimes we forget that and we demonize Mao as being an ideologue. He was certainly an ideologue, but he held in common the major, most fundamental goal of rebuilding China into a world power. And in that, all three of those guys were alike. The way to achieve the new status for China was for the Communist Party of China, using communism with Chinese characteristics, to lead the peasants to build the new People's Republic of China that was founded in 1949. Here we have a photograph. It's a pretty famous photo of the People's Liberation Army entering the city of Beiping, which was later renamed Beijing, the northern capital. Mao's single greatest positive contribution to rebuilding China was his program of radical and thorough land reform. After all, if the majority of the people live on the land, what's the best way to create economic equity? It's to have land reform. It was a radical program in which land was taken away from landlords and given back to the farmers at the direction of the party. But the problem is that Mao's ideological zeal and his growing paranoia of the West ultimately undermined the gains that land reform program might have yielded for China in the long run. In fact, as we all know, Mao's era is really characterized by what I would call a myopic dedication to centralized economic and social planning by the state. His periodic campaigns to revitalize the revolution led to disasters like the ill-fated attempt to jumpstart China's industrial production, the so-called Great Leap Forward. This is an interesting example of the excesses of the Great Leap Forward. These were steel furnaces that the party encouraged peasants to build to boost the levels of steel production to those of Great Britain at the time. The Great Leap Forward led to one of the most severe famines in China's long history. China's road to national strength was also hampered by Mao's growing distrust of the Communist Party, especially in his attempts to reform it from outside of the party that we know as the Great Cultural Revolution. These campaigns were also, of course, inflamed by the same kind of cult of personality that Mao had specifically denounced immediately after Stalin's death. And by the time that Mao died in 1976, China really was a third world state that had made no progress whatsoever in reclaiming its identity as a world power. You could say that Mao sold the revolution out, in a sense. What had gone wrong? What was the problem? Was the problem something inherent in communism? Was it a leadership issue? What was going on? Well, one of the things that we have to understand about this whole history is that communism, as a philosophy of state leadership or moral philosophy, has a very specific view of history. And it posits that the only way for a state or a society to achieve the utopian goal of the elimination of classes is for that society to go through specific stages or steps. And those steps include capitalism and socialism. Okay? Mao's mistake in the eyes of most of his successors was in thinking that he could jump over those stages and proceed directly to the communist idealistic state. Okay? So according to them, the fault of Mao lay not in the ideology itself, but in its application. The man who replaced Mao as state and party leader in 1978, Mr. Deng Xiaoping, was himself a veteran of the famous Long March of 1934 that defined the Communist Party of China, and he was a celebrated military hero. But perhaps because he was a victim of Mao's cult of personality, Deng took a far more pragmatic approach to rebuilding China than Mao ever could have. He's perhaps best remembered for his saying, "It doesn't matter if the cat is white or black, as long as it catches mice." If Mao had said that, Mao would have said, absolutely, the cat must be white. If the cat is black, the cat should be thrown out and killed. Having seen the failures of Mao's economic and social campaigns and his ideological, myopic view of the world, Deng reversed course, especially in opening up China to foreign direct investment. We see this most specifically in the special economic zones that Deng created in the early 80s along the southeastern coast. And these are the 5 initial special economic zones. Deng's pragmatic economic policies and his goals were aimed mainly at domestic recovery. China must first recover at home before it could ever play any significant role on the international stage. Some saw this as proof that Deng was an incipient capitalist who would eventually bring China fully into the Western capitalistic world and abandon communism. But this was a misunderstanding, because in fact, Deng's pragmatic economic policies were not at odds with his identity as a communist and his belief that communist ideology and the Communist Party was still needed as China's guide to an egalitarian society. In fact, the fall of the Soviet Union and the riots that happened in Tiananmen Square about the same period of time, in fact, just confirmed for Deng the need for a strong, stable party to prevent instability and the sidetracking of the ultimate goal, rebuilding a strong China. If there's anything in history that has taught the people of China to fear, it is social chaos and instability. Phrases such as the famous "to get rich is glorious" epitomize this late 20th century Gilded Age in China, where we in the West thought, oh, great, we can sell 1 billion refrigerators to China. Deng's reforms were, at heart, a reversal of the economic centralization encouraged by Mao. Privatizing China's vast network of state-owned enterprises and giving the provinces new authority were supposed to result in everyone sharing in the wealth. We all know the results of Deng's opening up program. New business opportunities appeared, exports rose phenomenally, and a new generation of millionaires was created. And finally, China, once again, just as it had before the year 1800, become the world's bank, holding huge reserves of foreign wealth. But there were also some negative byproducts of China's domestic growth in Deng's hands. We all know the stories of the disappearance of guaranteed lifetime employment, health care, and education that ended with this same privatization program. Huge inequalities between the eastern urban hubs and the rest of China began to grow, and homelessness and chronic unemployment appeared for the first time in probably 40 or 50 years. All of this, of course, was exacerbated by a growing gap between the nouveau riche and the rest. Stepping back into the capitalist phase has certainly helped China domestically rebuild its economy, but that same liberalization has not pushed China into the next required stage, socialism, nor has it affected the political sector. In fact, as we all know, China remains a one-party communist state. The study of Marx, Lenin, Mao, and Deng thought is still required in school in China, and party membership is still also required for the most important jobs in government and education. But to many in China, the party looks more and more like a blatant ruse for power by an entrenched elite, if not an anachronism. But apart from the 1989 riots in Tiananmen Square, there have really been very few uprisings of the people calling for what we have heard recently, the Jasmine Revolution, like we see happening in the Arab world right now. Why not? Well, one reason might be that the recent call by China's current leadership to return to Confucian values and their acknowledgement that there are some real social and economic and even political problems in China that need to be addressed. The next historical stage, socialism, in fact, might be achieved by returning to China's most native and ancient form of religion or philosophy, Confucianism. This slide doesn't come out real well, but this is a huge bronze statue of Confucius that was erected on Tiananmen Square last year. And I suspect that Mao is turning at about 180 RPMs in his grave after this thing was erected. But this may not be so inconsistent with Mao's original vision as we think. Let me talk just briefly about Confucianism. The core value of Confucianism as a moral or political philosophy, or maybe even as a state religion, is an obedience to natural hierarchies of power that will ensure the proper functioning of society in order to avoid chaos and distress. The ideal relationship in Confucianism is the relationship between the father and the son. it's mirrored at the state level by similar bonds of leadership and obedience between the ruler and the people. And this relationship is characterized, in fact, by this notion of obedience. Okay? Ever since this moral philosophy appeared in China in the 6th century BCE, it's been the guide for both personal and state behavior. The role of the emperor, of course, was to lead and provide for the people. And the people, in return, just like the children to the father, should show loyalty and obedience to the emperor or the state. Now, 19th century revolutionaries like Sun thought that it was precisely this paternalistic Confucianism that was the root of China's real ills, because it suppressed the individual and heightened the authoritarian role of the state. In order for China to modernize, according to Sun and other revolutionaries and radicals, Confucianism should be thrown out and replaced with Western individualism. But we all know that culture is a pretty resilient force, and even Sun, the revolutionary who tried to develop this scientific new culture in China, couldn't escape his Confucian heritage. And if you look closely at the 3 principles of the people that I talked about a couple minutes ago, what you see is that that republic was a real idealistic mix of socialist and democratic values that were all guaranteed by the same paternalistic state that has characterized China from day one, practically. Let's go back and talk a little more about the uses of Confucianism, though, after Sun. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, who started out as a communist revolutionary, did a total about-face once he was in control of the republic, and he tried to reinvigorate Confucianism as state religion, especially with a movement that he called a New Life movement of 1934. That experiment in social engineering emphasized personal self-cultivation, public hygiene, and obedience to the state, and it drew heavily both on Confucianism and also on German fascist ideas. He argued that capitalism and communism were responsible for the political chaos and high levels of poverty and drug addiction that plagued China in the 1930s. Now, Jiang's republic focused on nationalism, but it really made no sincere attempt to implement the other 2 categories that Sun had proposed: democracy and providing for the people's livelihood. And in fact, if you look carefully at the New Life movement, which most historians don't really talk about anymore, it's a fascinating group because it was an attempt to enforce this Confucianized society by a group of essentially thugs. They were called the Blue Shirt Society, that were modeled on similar groups that were coming into existence in Germany right at the same period of time. And it never gained traction among China's huge rural population. Jiang's invocation of Confucianism also, of course, played nicely into Chinese communist hands, who used it to demonstrate how really out of touch Jiang was with the common people. So it is in some respects quite surprising that Confucianism has once again emerged as the answer to China's problems and the way forward. But this time, it's being advocated by the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. After some 30 years of steady domestic economic growth, the 3rd generation of leaders after Mao has proclaimed a new era of building a harmonious society, and that's the literal translation of this banner, or these banners. This harmonious society will be governed by scientific principles. Curious mix. By the time that Mr. Hu Jintao ascended to the presidency of China and leadership of the Chinese Communist Party in 2002, China had certainly exceeded all of the expectations for domestic growth. But there were also some new problems abroad that invited China's participation in events such as the War on Terror. At the same time, that domestic growth had come with a price. We know the impacts of environmental degradation, the rise in unemployment, new social pressures on China's young generation, and et cetera, et cetera. And in an effort to keep the party relevant, President Hu has become an advocate for controlled economic growth, some loosening of the political process at home, and a more assertive role for China in global affairs. To accomplish these goals, the party officially embraced Hu's notion of a harmonious world as its guide to both domestic and international policies, most recently in the 6th plenum of the party's Central Committee meeting in 2006. Now, I'm going to argue that this new Confucianism is actually complementary both to communism and capitalism, and it presents China with a realistic way to achieve what its leaders, all the way from Sun Yat-sen down to the present, have focused on: rebuilding China to occupy the status of world power. Let's talk domestically. Domestically, new Confucianism revives the role of the Communist Party as chief educator, leader, and problem solver, or, if you will, father of the people. And it ensures its dominance of the political system. For example, the state has recently gone to quite unusual lengths to prove its moral bona fides by bringing to trial and imprisonment numbers of cases of high and medium level officials who have been corrupt. And while party membership has always been tightly controlled, it's now making new strides to clean up its own act by admission, by invitation only, and admission increasingly coupled with zealous background checks and a pretty strict curriculum of education that emphasizes not just classical communist writings, but also moral probity of its members. Interestingly, also, for the first time, the reading of Confucian classics has re-entered the curriculum of party membership. The party also points effectively to examples of the rise of the corrupt oligarchy in post-Soviet Russia to reinforce the central role of the party in politics in China. Now, since the perennial concern of every Chinese state down through history has been to keep its farmers happy and economically secure, the state has also begun a new, pretty highly publicized campaign of investment in poor Western provinces. This is actually a pretty interesting map of rural poverty. One of the side effects, I mentioned this earlier, one of the major side effects of Deng's economic opening up was that the eastern seaboard got rich and pretty much everybody else was left out. So the party and the state have begun this campaign of investment in the West, so to speak, to battle the impression that a few Easterners and Eastern provinces have profited at the expense of everyone else. Because those Eastern factories that are still largely located along the Eastern seaboard also drew heavily on rural farmers for their workforce, China has had an unprecedented rise in rural to urban illegal migration. And this has had the double effect of the decline in agricultural production and jobs and new urban crowding. And this map just shows you the layout of urban population bases. You can see this level of city, 1 million to 5 million. Pretty good scattering of what are in China called medium level cities, 1 million to 5 million. All of this might have been manageable, all of this urban crowding, rural to urban migration, all of this stuff might have been manageable in good times. But once exports dropped a few years ago, the state was forced to deal with another problem not seen since the 1930s, growing numbers of urban, unemployed, and homeless. This is an interesting set of statistics. The first table is taken from the People's Republic of China yearbooks, 1978 and 2002, and the last figure down on the bottom is a 2010 estimate by the CIA of rural versus urban population. One of the subtexts of my talk here is that just in the last 10 years, China has had a phenomenal shift in its population from rural to urban, which is going to have huge ramifications for the party and for its economic policies. To try to combat this problem, the state has tried to stimulate growth in rural areas by trying to stop wild land speculation and by moving factories inland closer to rural communities. But the jury is still out on whether these moves are going to succeed in reversing the kinds of trends I've just talked about. Where President Hu's revival of Confucianism really provides traction for China, I think, is in its quest to regain its status as a regional and world power. The international corollary to Hu's domestic harmonious society is, of course, an international harmonious world that will result from China's shift from projecting hard power to projecting and using soft power in regional and international contexts. And China does this increasingly by using the rhetoric of reciprocity and mutual respect among nations, not conflict. According to recent statements by the People's Republic of China, China is uniquely positioned to lead the way in building a harmonious world precisely because of its unique Confucian heritage and culture. And in fact, some of the recent statements that have come out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs explicitly contrast Confucian harmonious society, i.e. China, with Western societies that are based on Judeo-Christian notions of conflict. Interesting. We can see this rhetoric being employed in China's leadership role in two regional state associations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that governs relations between China, Russia, and Central Asia, and ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Similar multilateralism in regional affairs is guiding China's leading role in the Korean Peninsula, as we all know. China's deployment of these new approaches of soft power and reciprocity were certainly given a boost with the recent Bush twin doctrines of preemption and axis of evil. And all of a sudden, on the international stage, it was China that looked like the benevolent state going around freely dispensing aid and viewing other states as potential allies and friends, not potential foes. An example that I can give you of this discourse, the change in this discourse, a friend of mine from Kuala Lumpur told me about a story of in quick succession, Presidents Bush and President Hu, within a matter of a few days. Bush came first, and his speeches all harked on the notion of national security, the potential threats in the region, and the growing menace of Islam. Hu came to town and didn't talk at all about security issues. His speeches were characterized by the attitude of, what can we do to help you? How can we invest in your economy? How can we be partners? Statements by China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs also constantly raise this theme of China's emerging role in constructing a harmonious world. So, where will China go from here? And I've got a couple of possibilities. The man being groomed to succeed Hu has a similar pragmatic streak as Hu and his immediate predecessors. Mr. Xi Jinping is currently the vice chair of the Central Military Commission, which sets him up automatically to take over Hu's positions as president and General Secretary of the party. She comes from a family of liberal party activists who supported Deng's initial reform programs and were cashiered after 1989 when Deng tried to pull back. Mr. Xi has also served as governor of Fujian province on the southeast coast, and he has apparently developed a fairly high level of trust within the party that even Mr. Hu didn't enjoy when he was first promoted to his current leadership position. Xi Jinping will have to navigate some pretty treacherous shoals in guiding China in the next decade. Inflation and food prices are on the rise, the unemployment crisis hasn't yet been solved, and new forms of social networking, Gracie, make it more difficult for the party to maintain its control over the younger generations. It's also interesting to note that the state is returning to state-owned enterprises. Historically, it is precisely at these times of lurking instability that states employ nationalism informed by cultural uniqueness to bolster their power. Recent vocal and sometimes violent expressions of nationalism in China shouldn't surprise us, nor do they necessarily mean that China is our enemy or a threat. And we should also be clear that not everybody in the party or the central government agree that China should shift from projecting hard power and a philosophy of struggle to soft power and philosophy of harmony. But Hu's new paradigm presents the world, I think, with a unique opportunity to engage China constructively. The next generation, and specifically Xi Jinping, may be forced by events and new technologies to open up the possibility of some greater political freedom, even if that freedom is still within the context of a dominant Communist Party. After all, we also have to remember that the Chinese Communist Party is no more monolithic in opinion than political parties in the West. Okay? Sometimes we make that mistake of assuming that monolithic identity. Moreover, under leaders like Xi, the party will undoubtedly continue to seek pragmatic answers to problems. We should also remember that Deng's policies moved a lot of real power from the center to the provinces. He decentralized a lot of China. As a result, provincial and national interests in China often collide and don't cooperate. And the hierarchies of real power in China today, I believe, are much more complex, regional, and perhaps diffused than they have ever been in China's long political history. Moreover, this new Confucianized nationalism also provides a way for a newly confident China to undertake its share of international responsibilities within larger normative frameworks that will also possibly act as a check on China's power. For example, its participation in UN peacekeeping missions and WTO are just a couple of examples. China has steadily emerged from its isolation of the Mao years. Deng Xiaoping was careful to combine his energetic domestic economic program with a passive foreign policy position, embodied most famously in phrases like hiding one's capacity while biding one's time and not seeking to lead. His successor, Jiang Zemin, slowly ramped up China's position in the international arena with a policy that was encapsulated by the phrases developing China as a comprehensive power and building a new international order. Hu and his third generation of leaders after Mao turned back to Confucianism to bolster the party and the state. A new moral compass is required now that the problems with ideological communism and capitalism have been experienced. The turn to the ancient system of Confucianism makes eminent sense. It reinforces a fairly conservative hierarchy of state power guided by the party, and it provides a focus and salient expression of Chinese nationalism, And finally, it even promotes the kind of socialism that China should now be entering on the way to the egalitarian society. The point here, finally, is that China's new nationalism is really anything but new, but it presents the rest of the world with unimagined opportunities for engagement. Perhaps only in the 7th century or the 15th century CE, during the Tang and Ming dynasties, respectively, was China anywhere in a similar position of being an emergent world power that was genuinely interested in positive international engagement via the use of soft power. And I'll end there. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions, so if you'll direct them to Michael, please.
Yes.
You're talking about soft power and harmony, but we recently experienced a situation where the military rose in deference to the party, apparently with the jet situation, where they revealed that at the same time that the party was trying to propose harmony.
Right.
Comment.
Yeah, it's a fascinating example, I think, of the complexities of real power in China, and I think one of the other things it tells us is that China is no longer going to be interested to take a back seat to anyone. I don't see this as a threat, though. I see this as a very decisive expression of China's power. It could be threat, but yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
How important is world public opinion to the Chinese leadership and also to the general population, especially in the provinces?
Yeah. So the question is, how important is world power to the Chinese leadership and to the people of China, especially in the provinces? I would argue that China, it's very important to all of those parties. China really carefully cultivates its face to the outside world. And it's very concerned about how the rest of the world views it. Yeah. I could go on and on, but I'm going to try and be brief to get more questions. Yeah.
Would you comment on I believe it's Confucian idea, the mandate of heaven and how that plays a role?
Yes.
Has played a role right along.
Yeah, the Confucian mandate of heaven was this ancient doctrine that legitimized the role of the emperor as the ruler. Okay, the emperor wasn't a divine being, but was sort of the go-between between heaven and the people. In some respects, the party has taken on the role of the emperor. Okay. And so, historians or sociologists or political scientists of contemporary China look to what China is, and in some respects, the forms of power are quite similar to what they were in the imperial period. I think, however, that this notion of the mandate of heaven, and by the way, the mandate of heaven was last really invoked with the earthquake that preceded Mao's death in 1976. It's a really interesting story. We can talk about it further if you're interested. But that was the last time that was really invoked socially as being an operative principle. The mandate of heaven idea, though, is something that I think is certainly still present. And it's one of the ways in which Confucianism it helps the party survive in that position. Now, they might not call it the mandate of heaven, but they're invoking some of the same principles. There was a hand way in the back there who's been up for a while.
Let's see, I'm wondering about your use of market Leninism and if you could compare that to European socialism, primarily with regard to private property.
Yeah, private property is a really interesting issue. Just in the last 2 years, there have been some significant changes in property ownership laws, and so private property is now a possibility in China. So the question was to talk about market Leninism, and by the way, these last two diagrams come from a pretty interesting article written by Dennis Wilder a few years ago. So, and Dennis charts two possibilities for rising China. One, sort of the route that we all assume, is that rising China is going to become increasingly free, but not necessarily. With rising China and with the continuing domination of the party, though, that path might be short-circuited. Who knows? The role of market Leninism is pretty strong, I would argue, in China. But it's probably more complicated than is going on in post-Soviet Russia, if you will. I don't know if we want to spend more time on that now, though. I want to get some more questions.
Is there a lesson from the relationship between Tibet and China, and will Chinese nationalism result in more imperialism than other countries?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is regarding Tibet, and will Chinese... Can you restate the question again?
Will Chinese nationalism, should we fear that more because they're not just interested in power, but in also actually taking over?
Right. Okay, so the question is China more interested in territorial acquisition as opposed to just nationalism? The whole issue of territorial integrity goes back to how the state perceives the ideal China, if you will, okay? The ideal China, the map of ideal China, comes from the late imperial period, when places like Tibet and Inner Mongolia and Taiwan were all a part of the state, okay? So for China to claim, and also the Northwest, Xinjiang province, for China to continue to dominate those areas from its point of view is entirely natural, because its interpretation of history has been that those areas have been a part of the state for a long period of time. So I personally don't think China is interested in external territorial acquisition. I think that the exercise of soft power and economic domination are much more cost-effective ways to go about becoming a world power. Back there.
What about, can you speak to continued marginalization and repression of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province?
Yeah, the Uyghurs up in Xinjiang. Oh boy, that's a complicated topic because it involves all sorts of issues of interpretations of Islam. It involves a certain group of Uyghurs who are obviously interested in the secession of that part of China, okay, and becoming its own province or its own state, if you will. I don't see that happening. The Uyghurs up in Xinjiang, the people who are separatists, look across the border at what happened in the Stans after the Soviet Union fell. The problem is that the situation in the Stans were quite different, certainly from a population point of view, than they are in Xinjiang. The reality of the situation is that I don't believe Xinjiang will ever be able to secede from the state of China, but I also don't think that most Uyghurs want that. I think that it's a minority dominant voice that is largely an expat community residing in Washington, D.C. and in Turkey that are promoting that program.
I think we're going to have to bring the Q&A to a stop, but if you still have questions, bring them to the discussion and we can pose them there. So thank you very much.
Thanks.